ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਵੀਡੀਓ ਇਨਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਵਾਲੀ ਵੀਡੀਓ ਹੋਊਗੀ। ਇਹ 'ਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਜੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੀ ਵੱਡੀਆਂ ਅਪਡੇਟਸ ਆ ਚੁੱਕੀਆਂ ਹੈ 2024 ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ। ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਆਈ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਵੀ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਇਹ ਹੈਗਾ ਵਾ ਕਿ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸਟੱਡੀ ਵੀਜ਼ਾ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਅਤੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਸਪੈਸੀਫਿਕ ਅਮਾਊਂਟ ਜਮ੍ਹਾਂ ਕਰਵਾਉਣੀ ਪੈਂਦੀ ਸੀ GIC, ਉਹ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ $10,000। ਪਰ ਹੁਣ ਅਗਲੇ ਸਾਲ ਤੋਂ ਜੀ ਇਹ ਕਰਤੀ ਗਈ ਹੈ ਡਬਲ ਅਮਾਊਂਟ, ਜੋ ਕਿ 20,000 ਕੁਛ ਰੁਪਏ ਆ। ਮੈਂ ਇੱਧਰ ਸਾਈਡ 'ਤੇ ਫੋਟੋ ਪਾ ਦਿੰਦਾ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਚੈੱਕ ਕਰਿਓ। ਹੁਣ ਲਗਭਗ ਜੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਆਉਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਆਲਮੋਸਟ 30 ਲੱਖ ਰੁਪਇਆ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਕਰੂਗਾ। ਇਹ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਗੌਰਮੈਂਟ ਕਾਫੀ ਟਾਈਮ ਤੋਂ ਜੀ ਇਹ ਸੋਚ ਰਹੀ ਸੀਗੀ GIC ਦੀ ਅਮਾਊਂਟ ਵਧਾਉਣ ਲਈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਾਫੀ ਰਿਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਆ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਬਈ ਗਰੋਸਰੀ ਅਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਰਹਿਣ ਸਹਿਣ ਦਾ ਖਰਚਾ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਤੋਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਨਿਕਲਦਾ। ਤਾਂ ਕਰਕੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਨੇ ਜੋ ਕਿ GIC ਦੀ ਅਮਾਊਂਟ ਆ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਹੀ ਡਬਲ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਕੀ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਆ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਉਣ ਦੇ ਕਮੈਂਟ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਦੱਸਿਓ।
Starting in January 1st of next year, in 2024, the financial requirement for study permits will be raised to reflect the current cost of living. And as such, a single applicant will need to show that they have $20,635 in funds to support themselves in Canada, moving up from $10,000, as I mentioned in French. Moving to a more accurate cost of living level that helps international students arrive with necessary resources to live and study in Canada. Future increases will be tied to the low income cutoff that Statistics Canada publishes.
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਆਪਣੀ ਅਗਲੀ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਦੀ। ਇਹ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਵਰਕ ਦੇ ਰਿਲੇਟਡ। ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਜੋ ਕਿ ਸੀਗਾ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟ 20 ਘੰਟੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ, ਬਟ ਹੁਣ ਨਵੀਂ ਪੋਲਿਸੀ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟ 20 ਘੰਟੇ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ 30 ਅਪ੍ਰੈਲ 2024 ਤੱਕ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਜਿਹਨੇ 7 ਦਸੰਬਰ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਫਾਈਲ ਜਾਂ ਉਸ 7 ਦਸੰਬਰ ਵਾਲੇ ਦਿਨ ਫਾਈਲ ਲਗਾਈ ਆ ਜੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵੀਜ਼ਾ ਦੀ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਇਹਦੇ ਅੰਡਰ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਆ। ਉਹ ਵੀ ਆ ਕੇ ਇੱਥੋਂ 20 ਘੰਟੇ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ। ਪਰ ਮੇਨ ਚੱਕਰ ਹੈ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕੰਮ ਮਿਲੇ। ਅਤੇ ਬਾਈ ਫਿਲਹਾਲ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਟੈਂਪਰੇਰੀ ਹੀ ਆ ਵਰਕ ਵਾਲਾ 20 ਘੰਟੇ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਲਾ, ਪਰ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਗੌਰਮੈਂਟ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਪਰਮਾਨੈਂਟ ਵੀ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇਨ ਫਿਊਚਰ। ਅਤੇ ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਇਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੀ ਵਧੀਆ ਚੀਜ਼ ਆ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟ ਜੋ ਕਿ ਆ 20 ਘੰਟੇ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਣਗੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਫਿਰ ਉਸ ਹਿਸਾਬ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਣੀ ਅਗਲੀ ਫੀਸ ਵੀ ਕੱਢ ਸਕਦੇ।
Time to meet their needs, we will extend the temporary policy that has allowed eligible international students to work more than 20 hours per week through till April 30th of 2024, the end of the academic year. We're currently examining options for this policy in the future, but we know that 40 hours a week is untenable if you're a student, and are looking to potentially expand off-campus work hours for international students up to 30 hours per week while class is in session. Our data shows us that 80% of international students or more work more than 20 hours a week. We first implemented distance learning measures in 2020.
ਤੇ ਚਲੋ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜੀ ਸੈਕਿੰਡ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਦੀ, ਜੋ ਕਿ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਆ। ਉਹ ਇਹ ਆ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਪੈਸੀਫਿਕ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟ ਵੀਜ਼ਾ ਆ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਲਿਮਿਟਿਡ ਅਮਾਊਂਟ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਜਾਊਗੇ। ਕਿ ਮੈਂ YouTube 'ਤੇ ਵੀ ਵੇਖਿਆ ਕਈ ਜਾਣੇ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਕਿ ਵੀਜ਼ਾ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਜਾਊਗੇ। ਇਹ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਗਲਤ ਆ। ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਨੇ ਸਪੈਸੀਫਿਕ ਇੱਕ ਪੋਸਟ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਧਰ ਸਾਈਡ 'ਤੇ ਸ਼ੋਅ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੋਊਗੀ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਜੀ। ਲਿਮਿਟਡ
Ahead of September 2024, we are prepared to take necessary measures, including significantly limiting visas, and are looking to potentially expand off-campus work hours for international students up to 30 hours.
ਬਈ ਆਹ ਸੀ ਜੀ ਮੇਜਰ ਅਪਡੇਟਸ 2024 ਦੇ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟ ਵੀਜ਼ਾ ਦੇ ਰਿਲੇਟਡ। ਇਹਦੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਫਾਇਦੇ ਵੀ ਆ ਅਤੇ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਵੀ ਆ। ਫਾਇਦੇ ਇਹ ਆ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਹੁਣ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਾਂਗੇ ਅਤੇ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਪੈਸੇ ਕਮਾ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਫੀਸ ਫੂਸ ਜੋ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਭਰ ਸਕਾਂਗੇ। ਅਤੇ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਨਵੇਂ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟ ਨੇ ਆਉਣਾ ਉਹਨੇ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ 20,000 GIC ਅਮਾਊਂਟ ਪੇ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ, ਅਤੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਨਿਆਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੋਣੇ ਆ 20 ਘੰਟੇ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ, ਅਤੇ ਨਵੇਂ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੰਮ ਮਿਲਣਾ ਹੋਰ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਔਖਾ ਹੋ ਜਾਣਾ ਆ। ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਜੀ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਵੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਆਉਣਾ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਧਿਆਨ ਰੱਖ ਕੇ ਫਿਰ ਆਇਓ, ਫਿਰ ਆਪਣਾ ਡਿਸੀਜ਼ਨ ਲਿਓ ਇੱਥੇ। ਅਤੇ ਬਾਈ ਕੁੱਲ ਮਿਲਾ ਕੇ ਗੱਲ ਹੁਣ ਇਹ ਆ ਜੀ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਆਉਣਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ 30 ਲੱਖ ਰੁਪਈਆ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ। ਅੱਗੇ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ 20-22 ਲੱਖ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਰ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈਗਾ, ਹੁਣ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ 30 ਲੱਖ ਰੁਪਈਆ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਆ। ਅਤੇ ਕਮੈਂਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਦੱਸਿਓ ਜੀ ਇਹ ਅਪਡੇਟਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਆ, ਵਧੀਆ ਕੀਤੇ ਗਏ ਆ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੇ ਗਏ ਆ। ਜੋ ਵੀ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਰਾਏ ਆ ਜੀ ਕਮੈਂਟ ਵਿੱਚ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਦੱਸਿਓ। ਅਤੇ ਬਾਕੀ ਮਿਲਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜੀ ਅਗਲੀ ਵੀਡੀਓ ਵਿੱਚ। ਚੈਨਲ ਨੂੰ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਸਬਸਕ੍ਰਾਈਬ। ਚੰਗਾ।
similar to other immigration programs. This cutoff conveys the income below which an individual may be in strained circumstances as they have to spend a greater than average proportion of their income on necessities. Recognizing that students already have to show that they can cover their tuition as well as other travel costs, their cost of living threshold is set at 75% of the low income cutoff rather than 100% and puts us on par with our competitor countries. So next year we intend to implement targeted pilots that will test new ideas aimed at helping underrepresented cohorts of international students to pursue their studies in Canada. And we also plan to work with institutions, provinces and territories to provide students with what they need to succeed. And I will have more to say on this a little earlier on in 2024. I'd also like to update you on 3 temporary policies affecting international students that were set to expire by the end of the year. The main purpose for an international student to be in Canada is to study. However, since most students are currently halfway through their school year and some are working full-time to meet their needs, we will extend the temporary policy that has allowed eligible international students to work more than 20 hours per week through till April 30th of 2024, the end of the academic year. We're currently examining options for this policy in the future, but we know that 40 hours a week is untenable if you're a student and are looking to potentially expand off-campus work hours for international students up to 30 hours per week while class is in session. Our data shows us that 80% of international students or more work more than 20 hours a week. We first implemented distance learning measures in 2020 due to the travel restrictions during the pandemic and reduced them in scope in September of 2022. But since the vast majority of international students are now actually studying in person in Canada, we're extending this measure only to those starting programs before September 1st of 2024. And finally, in response to the labor market disruptions over the pandemic, we introduced a temporary policy granting post-graduation work permit holders an additional 18-month open work permit if needed. Those with a post-graduate work permit expiring by the end of this year remain eligible to apply, and we won't be extending that policy after that. Protecting and supporting international students from becoming vulnerable, whether that's to bad actors or simply meeting their needs in Canada, is one of the main goals of our review of the International Student Program. These students contribute to boosting Canada's economy. Taking these additional steps today contributes to our long-term goal, which is to preserve the integrity of the International Student Program. It'll be key in all this to work with our provincial and territorial counterparts, which have an important share of the jurisdiction and responsibility in this, as well as other education and stakeholders, including the learning institutions themselves, so that we can ensure that international students really are set up for success in Canada. Thank you, and on that, I'm glad to take your questions.
Minister, you referred to the universities not liking the bluntness of some of the instruments that you might use. What did you mean by that, and what do you expect universities to do?
So, Rafi, I mentioned institutions themselves, and they have a very large portion of the responsibility in making sure that the student experience is properly reflected in the resources that they're given, whether it's providing housing, whether it's providing proper health supports and a proper academic experience. There is a responsibility on behalf of the provinces that designate the learning institutions in question to make sure that those are actually the institutions that are worthy of getting visas from the government of Canada. There are, in provinces, the diploma equivalent of puppy mills that are just churning out diplomas. And this is not a legitimate student experience. There is fraud and abuse, and it needs to end. When you take, for example, the province of Ontario, there have been Auditor General reports that have recommended some very important measures that have not been put into place, and that has contributed to the abuse. So the bluntness of the instruments that we have at the federal government level, in addition to the fraud task forces, is the strict removal of visas, which can have a number of effects and can have ripple effects, whether we designate a particular institution in particular or whether we simply take other measures to significantly reduce this. The federal government can't do it alone because our measures and the measures that we have, the policies that we have, can have ripple effects on the portrait of an international student experience could look like, and we could potentially miss the mark. Provinces have a number of tools at their disposal, namely the regulation of the designated learning institutions that in some cases just need to be shut down.
Have you taken a look at what impact that extension could have on permanent residents in Canada who are competing for those same jobs with the students?
You're talking about the work hours?
Yeah.
Well, look, there's labor shortages across the country. The measure that was put into place during COVID was one that was designated to make sure that those shortages were being addressed. It was popular. We had heard legitimately from students that a 20-hour work week is doable and is something that people could actually study at the same time and work 20 hours. Also, employers were looking for people that could potentially commit for over 20 hours and perhaps only work 20. So it was limiting the availability for students out there. It is costly to be a student in Canada. So having that flexibility and dealing with those two competing public policies, I think, was one of the challenges that we're still juggling with. We know that over 80% of international students are factually working over 20 hours, but 40 hours is just untenable. It is not credible that someone, except for rare occasions, could work a full work week and actually study at the same time. I know, having done it myself, and I know lots of people that have worked very hard, but those 40-hour works week drain you, and it is not reflective of a proper student experience. But there is flexibility, and we were looking at an hour category in and around 30 hours, but it hasn't been decided yet. So given the financial pressures that current students in Canada would be feeling had we taken a decision to roll it back to 20 hours, it didn't make sense, and would probably perhaps put more strain on students that are currently struggling to make ends meet. I don't think students are taking jobs away from other people, given the labor shortages that are happening in Canada. My focus primarily is to make sure that the public policy that we have in place is one that reflects the ability of the student to actually do what they're supposed to be doing, which is study, without bankrupting themselves. So there's a middle ground there that we need to look at. I'm going to look at more data with my team to make sure that something like 30 hours actually makes sense. But currently, with the data that we know, rolling it back to 20 hours would have been